This summer, as Catholics across the country stand up for their religious liberty, we thought it might be nice to feature bookmark episodes from years past that deal with the faith of our founders and the first of our First Amendment rights. We hope you enjoy the following interview from our archives. And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author is Dr. Thomas Woods, and the book is How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization, published by Regnery Publishing. Welcome, Dr. Woods, to EWTN's Bookmark.
Thank you, Doug.
Great to have you here. A lot of people out there would say how the Catholic Church built Western civilization. You know, I think there'd be a lot of people out there who would agree with that and say that's part of the problem, because they've got a problem with Western civilization, don't they?
That's true. So if you don't like Western civilization, if you're saying, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western civ's got to go, this is not the book for you.
Right. Now, what prompted you to write this book, and why did you focus on the Catholic aspect of it? I mean, you're not a priest, you're a teacher. What are you, a historian?
Yes.
Okay. Why this particular area? What prompted this?
Well, I think, Doug, a lot of us say to people that, hey, after all, the Catholic Church built the West. But when hard-pressed, it's sometimes difficult to come up with specifics other than art and music and things of that kind. And what I wanted to do was two things, mainly, was to put some meat on this assertion and show the influence of the Church throughout our civilization in ways that Catholics themselves, I think, don't even appreciate sometimes. But then also to go after some of the myths about the Catholic Church. For example, that the ones I get from students all the time. The Church promoted ignorance so as to keep the people stupid so the Church could dominate them and all this and that. Or the Church has obstructed the sciences. These types of things are repeated so often, Doug, that I get the sense that even Catholics themselves sort of interiorize some of them and in the back of their minds think to themselves, well, you know, hasn't the Church really done these things after all? Shouldn't we be sorry about this? Certainly we should regret some things that some churchmen have done, but let's make sure we understand which things they really have done.
Right. And of course, that's why even our late great Holy Father, who you reference in the sense that when this book was, coming out,
yes,
or just about to be published, it was when he had just passed, apologized for certain things that were done in the past that the Church did that was wrong, in the sense of things like that, or that was done by members of the Church, whether to the Jewish population or to other groups or denominations around the world. So certainly there are things that the Church, which I think was a wonderful thing to do, because it shows how, I think, loving and forgiving the Church can be, in openness and asking for forgiveness where it's appropriate. But sometimes I think that gets exaggerated, and we deal with Pius XII issues, obviously. And the point I thought was interesting that you had here, you talked about Philip Jenkins at the beginning of the book, distinguished professor of history, talks about anti-Catholicism, one remaining acceptable prejudice in America. I think there was, Schlesinger said something like that years ago as well. The thing you point out about your students, about alleged church corruption, and you say that they heard these ceaseless tales of varying credibility from their high school teachers. So that's the thing. It's not even a question that struck me in the book that even just generally in the media this is it, but this is actually being inculcated. Why?
It's all over the schools, to the point where when my students come into my classroom, they're skeptical of some of the statements I'm making because it's exactly the opposite of what they've been told about the Church. And I think in some cases, I think there are two reasons that this is happening. In some cases, it's just plain ignorance, because when you have something that you're taught and then your teacher was taught that and that teacher was taught that, for example, about the Church and science, well, naturally you just adopt it. Now, as I show in the book, for the past at least 50 years, scholars have been saying that you cannot simply say the Church was just an obstacle to the sciences. There's much more to be said on behalf of the Church, but that type of stuff does not trickle down to the general public very quickly. So you continue to get the same misinformed information.
Is that because it doesn't jive with the popular culture? It doesn't jive with the media's perspective? Why do you think that is?
I think partly because the simple fact that people tend not to read books published by Cambridge University Press and Oxford. So these are books that are read by other professors, but they don't make it to the general public. But that's not entirely the explanation, because some some books that are published by Oxford and Cambridge, their messages do trickle down to the general public. It seems to me that if the message conforms to what people want to believe or are prepared to believe, then it will get out. So that's part of the purpose of my book, is to take some of this specialized work that's sitting out there and make it accessible to a popular audience. But I would just note, Doug, that the second explanation, I think we cannot discount simple bad will and simple anti-Catholic prejudice. There is some of that out there. I don't think there's any question about that, and I think that colors why it is people are taught certain things about the church and not others.
Well, are we dealing with this kind of secularist attitude, that we dealt with, let's say, after World War II, et cetera, and maybe even people today would go and say, gee, a lot of the radical types from the 50s and into the 60s, those are the people, and a lot of times, who went into academia.
That's right, and they went into it not necessarily with a kind of a disinterested desire to pursue truth. I think some of them are in academia to pursue propaganda. And particularly given that so many of them are fairly rigorous secularists, the message that they want to transmit is that all the good things in our civilization came from either ancient Greece and Rome, so pre-Christian, or from the Enlightenment, which was at least largely anti-Christian. And that is exactly the message, as you know, that we saw in the European Union Constitution, that made no mention of the continent's religious heritage, but that privileged the ancient world and the Enlightenment, as if in that more than 1,500 years in between, or 1,000 years, nothing of value occurred. That's just not a sustainable view.
Well, it's interesting. In a sense, it's almost what you run into sometimes in Protestantism, in the sense that, from the end of the close of Acts or, John's Gospel till the Reformation, what was going on?
Well, in fact, Doug, that's one of the problems I had with Protestantism. And if you were Marcus Grodi, I'd go down that whole route and tell you why I just decided I couldn't be a Lutheran anymore.
Okay. So that was an issue as well. Because you write here, the Western civilization stands indebted to the Church for the university system, charitable work, international law, the sciences, important legal principles, et cetera, et cetera. You go on to enumerate them. One of the things that I thought was interesting was, here's all these professors railing against basically the organization that started the university system.
That is a certain irony. I show that the university system more or less started around the year 1200, so in the high Middle Ages. So right off the bat, you have to understand that it could hardly be a dark age that gives us the great gift that was the university. It was something absolutely new, not only in the West, but in the world. And the university system was consistently protected by the popes. The universities used to run into a lot of problems. For example, I grew up in a college town, and on the one hand, you love the students because they got a ton of money to spend on stuff in the town, but they're unruly and they put trash in your yard and you don't know how to deal with them. And in the old days, that's how people felt. They loved the money and they hated the students. And the students would sometimes be treated very badly and unfairly. The papacy intervened, gave the students benefit of clergy so students could have their cases heard in church courts. The popes used to intervene to make sure the universities were paying the professors' salaries, a point that I can appreciate in particular.
Right.
But repeatedly...
You would think they'd appreciate that as well.
And I have no doubt. In fact, it probably bolstered their Catholicism when this happened.
Right.
But case after case...
Well, maybe if the Pope could do that today, they'd
in fact, we'll see a whole slew of conversions.
Right, there you go.
But one of my favorite things about the old universities, though, is that in the afternoons after the lectures, one of the professors would get up before the assembled university community and have his afternoon disputation, where he would take some controversial topic, and then in scholastic fashion he would entertain objections, lay out his position, and then answer objections, and then open himself up to the entire university community for catcalls and questions and comments. And that was a rigorous, difficult thing to do. And to me, I think it would really liven up our university system today to get some of these tenured guys out of their offices and down there, standing there and answering for some of the things they've written in the same format.
Right. Well, it's always interesting, I think, today to deal with people who were very into open discourse at a certain point in time when, let's say, they weren't in control of the departments, et cetera. That now that they are in control of those departments, really are not interested in having their dogmatic positions questioned.
That's right. It turns out that the calls for open dialogue are really just a ploy because, I mean, a lot of times, of course, today we don't have the Inquisition, but we do have a situation in which certain people of certain philosophical bents will hire only people like themselves. So that you go up before a search committee, they'll hire somebody because the person sort of toes the line. Yeah, that's sort of a shame.
Well, if a person is as brilliant as I am, they must come to the same conclusion, so they must be a good hire.
Yeah, well, you would think.
You would think that might
That's
help.
right.
You also write here, recent scholarship has definitely revised in the Church's favor regarding certain things, including the Inquisition. You say this is not merely special pleading on the author's part, but clearly stated conclusion, the best and most recent scholarship. And we've run a program that the BBC has aired, whether I forget whether they produced it or not, about the myths of the Inquisition, which really shows that, yeah, there were abuses here and there, but not to the level of this black myth that's out there. And we even have good Catholics who watch this network who sent us an email saying, gee, you shouldn't be trying to whitewash what the church did. So, I mean, that's how deep this indoctrination of these kinds of black myths have reached even into good Catholics.
That's right, that's right. And you know, it's not to say that two wrongs make a right, but it is worth noting that in the single year of the reign of terror in the French Revolution, or year and a half, that was carried out by anti-clericalists and deists and atheists, that claimed more lives than the entire history of the Inquisition put together in just that 18-month period. Mm-hmm. And yet, okay, people have sort of heard of the French Revolutionary Reign of Terror, but I bet if you ask a typical high school student, he's much more likely to know about the alleged millions who were killed in the Inquisition.
And you always hear this canard about more people have been killed in the name of religion than any place else. But meanwhile, you have these people without religion, basically, the French Revolution. Right. You have the Nazis who are without religion, basically, right. The communists. Right. And we know, even they've been revising, I think, the numbers up to, what, 80 million plus just in China alone of people who died.
Yeah, it's absolutely staggering, the deaths of the 20th century. I mean, you know, I can think of one writer who once said that if you add up all the people who perished in the Inquisition, you know, that's the number of people Stalin would have killed in a good afternoon. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, in fact, what the 20th century seems to show is just how lethal officially atheistic regimes are.
Right, and what you're showing really is, in this work, is that in all of these areas, the arts, all the things all the academics care about, the arts, charity, good work, all of those things are the things the church brought into the culture and supported and kept going through the tough times. But yet, as you said earlier about there's, in a sense, you alluded to this prejudice against the Middle Ages. And there's a quote here from a book by Second Messiah by Christopher Knight, where you say, the establishment of the Romanized Christian era marked the beginning of the Dark Ages, the period of Western history when the lights went out all over learning and superstition replaced knowledge. Now that's what most people think.
Yeah, that is what most people think, but it is answered by the fact, as we've already covered, that the church encouraged the university system, and it's also answered by the fact that even non-Catholic scholars, and I try to cite them as much as I can so as to show there's no bias at work, have said that what is most interesting about the intellectual life of the Middle Ages is that reason was enthroned as the highest arbiter for intellectual disputes. That although there were certain limits, theological limits, nevertheless, the life at the university was tremendously free. There was tremendously robust debate, and it was, in fact, Edward Grant, who's a historian of science, has said that it would be hard to imagine how the scientific revolution, which is one of the great fruits of Western civilization, could have come about in the absence of the civilization produced in the Middle Ages that created this tradition whereby we have vigorous intellectual exchange and we submit our disputes to the arbitration of reason.
Yeah, well, you write in the book here that you list a whole bunch of leading scientific efforts that relate to people in the church, including the fact that the Jesuits who studied earthquakes, that seismology became known as the Jesuit science, and that contrary to what you hear, that it really was the church that was taking the lead in most of these scientific endeavors. I thought was interesting too, because always you get the Galileo thing, they throw the Galileo thing down. And what was interesting in the way you went through it was the idea that as long as Galileo talked about it as a theory without claiming it was absolutely fact, his theory, or for the Copernican theory, the church really didn't have a problem with it. It was only when he say, no, this is it, and it's the only way to believe.
That's right. In fact, I cite popes who take this position, that this is legitimate, that who assured Galileo of this. Galileo was welcomed and feted in Rome for his work early in his career. There were Jesuits who were verifying the things he was seeing and very excited to see him. So, so the Galileo case is, I think, although it is, we have to acknowledge, it's not the church's brightest moment,
right.
As we've said.
And the Pope apologized.
And that's right. And I think in the long run, it has done more than everything else put together to prejudice people against the church. So it had very bad consequences. But the fact is that this theory had been taught freely in Jesuit universities for many years. The problem was that Galileo did not have strict proof that the Earth moved, in fact, his proofs were really not very persuasive. He thought that the motion of the tides meant that the Earth was moving because the Earth's rotation and its revolution was shaking up the water, which is a not very good explanation.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some excellent arguments against his theory that he could not answer at that time, and yet he was prepared to start throwing out biblical verses and reinterpreting them, and that's not what a layman is supposed to do. And this is at a time with the Protestant Reformation having gotten started in the previous century, when the Catholic Church is being accused of not giving the Bible enough emphasis. So for this layman to go around making statements like this, well, naturally he's going to get some kind of a penalty, and so that's what
And
we
as you
wind up.
pointed out, and you mentioned in the book, he couldn't prove his theory.
No, he could not. I mean, the main
the time.
argument was that, and you can read more about this, that stellar parallax shifts should have been visible, and they weren't if heliocentrism was true. And pretty much, if you said that to Galileo, he would have to say, "Hey, look over there," and then run away. He had no reply to that.
Right. So there was a valid question about what
Yes,
he
there
was teaching.
there definitely was.
teaching
And by the
at
way,
time.
Cardinal Newman used to say, and Cardinal Newman was a great historian in his own right, he used to say, all right, even if I grant you the Galileo case, what else have you got? He found it interesting that this is the case everyone raises.
Right.
He said, maybe the fact that no one can think of another case implies that this may be more the exception than the rule.
Right, exactly. Well, you point out here that one can scarcely find a significant endeavor in the advancement of civilization during the Middle Ages in which the monks did not play a role. And thinking of our present Holy Father and the whole idea of revitalizing Europe, without any doubt, St. Benedict was the father of Europe. The Benedictines, his children, were the fathers of European civilization and played a big part in the development of international law, you say.
That's right. It is almost unbelievable, all the areas in which the monks were involved. I mean, we all know, and this is one thing that you're taught, that the monks copied texts laboriously and at great physical expense. But what's not so much known is that they were sort of like the present-day advisors to the third world of their day. And the third world of their day was Western Europe, which was a backwater. And they, in effect, taught people at a time of general collapse. They taught people irrigation. They introduced various crops here and there. They improved the infrastructure. They served as free inns for people who were shipwrecked or lost or without lodging. They, in effect, they became physicians who went out and sought after the sick in their area. I mean, there was almost nothing you can think of that they were not in one way or another involved in. And I cannot think of any parallel in any civilization anywhere to the versatility of the people who were the monks.
I think sometimes the image people have, which is a convenient one, of them copying is almost kind of this Luddite kind of, well, that's all they did. They didn't think. All they did was copy what came before.
Right, and for one thing, we have to acknowledge that even if that were true, copying is very important at a time when the Roman Empire has collapsed, people aren't exactly fascinated with education. You need somebody to maintain things and hold on. And you also need the fact that the monks kept literacy alive. When the Greeks went through a terrible trial from about 1100 to 800 BC, the Greek Dark Ages, they lost literacy altogether. Now, Western Europe was going through a similar crisis in the 5th century, 6th century.
With all the barbarian invasions.
The barbarian invasions,
You talk
fall
about
of Rome,
that,
that's right. And yet, this time, literacy was not lost. Why? Because the monks held on to it. And if one monastery got sacked, there were countless others that were entirely self-sufficient, that could reproduce everything that one had done.
And not only did they survive, but they ultimately, in a sense, domesticated and Christianized the barbarians.
That's right. They did this practically impossible task. Christopher Dawson says, Christopher Dawson, one of the great historians, says, imagine the task of going out there and trying to preach the gospel to people who believe in martial and warrior virtues and trying to teach them to turn the other cheek. This is utterly alien to them, but through their good example, this is what the monks did.
Like you said, revenge is justice.
Exactly. How do you get people
Killing
to think
somebody
differently?
is, and that's, I think, some of the troubling things we're dealing with today in certain parts of the world, where there seems to be this idea that, revenge is fine, and that killing someone, is not a problem at all, which is very foreign to Western culture, but only foreign really because of Christianity, right?
That's right. I mean, the emphasis on the individual's worth and dignity is something that when the Catholic Church introduced it was brand new in the world. I mean, Greece and Rome had wonderful civilizations, but they did not have the idea of the absolute sanctity of human life that the Catholic Church did. I mean, they permitted infanticide. Even Plato, a great philosopher that the Church has admired and Augustine admired, nevertheless, Plato even said that if a man is too poor and sick to work, he should be left to die.
Utilitarianism, really.
Exactly.
Which is what we're dealing with in today's society, isn't it?
In
with
today's
euthanasia?
society, that's right. So I mean, so the Catholic Church consistently has been that protector of life. It abolished the gladiator contests. It abolished infanticide. It did all these things. I mean, that is something that you would think it would get a little credit for that. You know, these are good things, unambiguously good things.
Well, say most people know about the charitable work of the Catholic Church, but what they often don't know is just how unique the Church's commitment to such work was. Why was it so unique?
Well, in the ancient world, there were things that were done for the less fortunate, but they were not done in quite the same spirit that it was done in the Catholic Church. In ancient Rome, I would do something for my fellow man in large part to call attention to my great liberality, or to put him in my debt someday if I need his vote or his assistance for something.
Kind of like the Godfather.
I mean, more or less, right. I'm going to remember that I did you a favor. That's
okay.
right. Whereas the idea that I'm going to help this person out with no thought of reciprocity, because God wants me to, because this person has the same dignity as a human being that I do, and I'm going to spend myself for this, would have been utterly nonsensical. But yet it is this type of fire that lights the world when the Catholic Church introduces her kind of charity. In fact, I give the story of a Roman soldier named Pachomius who was in Constantine's army, and when a famine and plague hit, it turns out that the Christians came out and provided for those people, even though they were persecuting the Christians.
And it was those kinds of things that brought the converts.
That's right. Pachomius said, what kind of religion could have this kind of regard for fellow human beings, even the same human beings who have persecuted them? I have to investigate that religion, and he converted.
Also, you say the idea of formulated rights comes from Western civilization. Specifically, it comes not from John Locke and Thomas Jefferson. Well, that would be news to a lot of people, as many might assume or are taught, but from the canon law of the Catholic Church.
Well, yeah, the point there is that the idea of individual rights, that I have certain immunities that cannot be interfered with by you. There are certain things that if you were to interfere with them, like my life or my property, you would be in the wrong. That idea actually, more and more scholars are saying, comes not from the 17th and 18th centuries or from the Enlightenment, but that in fact is building on a tradition going back to the 12th century, to canon lawyers in the Catholic Church who began to think about and develop these ideas as long ago as that time. So the more you look at the history of the West, the more you find the Catholic Church at the center.
You also go, because you're dealing with all different topics here, art and architecture, which I think a lot of people would see, and you obviously indicate that there's greater depth there than just the, gee, that's a nice cathedral there. But one of the things you point out, even in dealing with the charitable side and the religious side, you know, the Church gets a lot of attack on the kind of the being anti-woman. But yet, as you point out in the book here, at some point I think in the Roman times, it was so pro-woman in a sense that, as it is today, but pro-woman perceived that way against the culture, that it was considered a woman's religion, right? That's
right. I mean, it was disparagingly referred to as a woman's religion. And I also note that in the Middle Ages, women were running their own schools and convents and institutions of this kind, which would have been unthinkable in 5th century Athens.
Right.
You know, I mean, which is a point I've made on a number of occasions.
Or in many other cultures.
Or many other cultures, certainly. That's right. Yeah.
Well, you say near the end of the book, paradoxically, the importance of the Church to Western civilization has sometimes become clearer as its influence has waned. How so?
Well, I think sometimes we don't realize the role the Church plays in our civilization until it's gone. Sometimes you don't appreciate something until it's gone. Well, the Church's role in our culture is not gone, but it's certainly been diminished. And in its place, I think a story can be told by looking at works of art over the past few centuries and looking at works of art over the past few decades, and looking at those and what they're all about. And I have in there a little mention of the fact that a poll was done, a couple years ago, among modern artists. What was the most influential piece of modern art? And they cited Duchamp's The Fountain, which, for people who don't know that work, it's a man's urinal that this artist then signed. Okay. And that's the greatest work of modern art. Well, I feel like I don't even need a comment there, do I? Is there any need for comment after that?
Right,
I mean, it just goes to show that, I mean, when you look at the art that the church inspired, and then you look at that, I think you can see which one is teaching that there is a meaning to life, and that, that the creation is good, and that there is a good God, and there's beauty in the world.
There's beauty in the world.
And another point of view that looks only at darkness, despair, and meaninglessness.
Right. Well, you say so ingrained are the concepts that Catholicism introduced into the world that very often movements opposing it are nevertheless imbued with Christian ideas. You even talk about Marxism borrowing from religious ideas of the 16th century, certain Catholic Christian heresies.
Yeah, that's right. So that even when you try to oppose Catholicism, the ideas of it are so ingrained that you find yourself using Catholic language or using Catholic concepts and ideas. I mean, Marx certainly is moving toward, he thinks there is an end of history, which we do too. We're moving toward the end of history. But for Marx, it will usher in a perfect world. Well, for us, that perfect world would be heaven. But for him, it will be the communist state.
Here on earth.
Right.
Just before we go, how long did it take you actually to put this book together?
A couple of years, because in between doing it, I wrote The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History.
Which was a bestseller,
Which was a bestseller.
And you had you have a couple other works that relate to the Catholic Church as well, right?
I have a book on economics called The Church and the Market, and a book from Columbia University Press called The Church Confronts Modernity.
And what are you working on now?
Now I'm working on another American history book, because that actually is my field.
Okay.
I love the Catholic Church, but I'm going to do one more American history book from Random House, actually.
Okay, well maybe we'll get you back here on a couple of those Catholic books anyway.
That'd be wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. My pleasure.
Keep up the good work. Dr. Thomas Woods, author of How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization, published by Regnery Publishing, and available, naturally, through the EWTN Religious Catalog. You should check this book out, and check us out next time, right here on EWTN's Bookmark.